Now for today's program. E.J. Dionne is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, and university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown University. He is a nationally known and respected commentator on politics and has appeared on National Public Radio, MSNBC, and PBS. He is the author of many books, including the National Book Awardee nominee, Why Americans Hate Politics, and Code Red, How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. EJ has been named among the 25 most influential Washington journalists by the National Journal. Robert Siegel was the senior host of NPR's award-winning evening news magazine, All Things Considered, for 30 years. He was awarded the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism and has been honored with 3 silver batons from Alfred I. DuPont, Columbia University, as well as the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award. Currently, he hosts Navigating the New Abnormal, a series of web seminars sponsored by American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Robert is a special contributor to Moment Magazine and serves on the advisory board of Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Robert is the recipient of Moment's 2024 Inspirational Journalism Award. Please welcome E.J. Dionne and Robert Siegel.
The state of our democracy, the state of our electoral system is not under challenge because the Republicans won, I suppose, and they were the ones who challenged it the last time. So we're not here arguing about whether our electoral system has survived the election, but we have had a surprising result in the election. And EJ, I want to just begin first by hearing from you. When you have to sum up what happened, what you figure by now of all that you know of what happened on November 5th, how do you describe what just happened in the election?
Well, since confession is good for the soul, I should say that I did not see this coming. I thought at the end of the campaign that the trajectory was toward Harris. I thought that she was going to build up a much bigger lead among women than turned out to be the case. I thought she closed the campaign much more coherently, to put it gently, than Trump did. And that was wrong. And it was wrong because I missed the signs that were right there in front of me. And one of the things I've sort of been saying since the election is that, in a way, it was a run-of-the-mill election that produced an explosive result. The signs that were in front of us were what was happening with inflation, obviously the immigration issue, and just general frustration with an economy that The Economist magazine described a few weeks before the election as the envy of the world.
Yes.
And one of the most instructive things I saw was a slide from the Republican pollster Whit Ayers, which had 3 sets of numbers on it. Inflation under Trump and Biden, 1% under Trump, 5% average under Biden. Obviously, the big spike in 2022. The second number were interest rates, 3%, 6%. And the third were the price of a market basket of food, $100 under Trump, $125 under Biden. And then you might have added a fourth about the cost of housing, which I think was a major frustration for a lot of voters. Add to that Biden's approval rating was down to 40%, which is not the kind of approval rating that gets a party reelected. And that classic pollster question, it's somewhat hard to read, but tells us quite a bit. Is the country moving in the right direction or on the wrong track? Only 17% of voters said the country was moving in the right direction, according to the exit poll on election day. So looking at those numbers, you say it's kind of a miracle that Harris did as well as she did.
Well, as she did, yeah.
And yet, obviously, the election of Trump is explosive and raises all kinds of issues. I think the other thing to underscore is precisely because the election of Trump was explosive, because he won all of the swing states, there is a tendency to say he won by a landslide. This wasn't a landslide. And I think if he claims a big mandate, it could prove very troublesome to him down the road. When all the votes are counted from California, they count slowly. He'll probably end up with about 50% of the vote. It'll be a 1 or 2 point national victory. And the swing states, particularly Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, were quite close, so that it wouldn't have been hard to see another result. And that the Trump coattails were very limited down the ballot. The Republicans will eke out a small House majority, which Trump seems determined to eat away at by appointing Republican members of the House to various administration positions. And at best, in the swing states, the Republicans picked up only one Senate seat. Democrats survived in the other swing states, or on the Democrats on the ballot. So it's a huge deal for the country, and yet it wasn't a landslide. And the classic qualities of a normal election, voters were dissatisfied with the incumbents and voted for the other party, were key to the outcome.
It was a very, I would say, very broad but shallow
Correct.
victory.
That's exactly.
The one thing, by the way, that I would add before we move on to what Whit Ayres demonstrated in his slide presentation is that you have to be our age, EJ, to have remembered inflation, to have experienced it as an adult, as it hit the country a couple of years ago. The vast majority of people in the electorate had never seen their cost of living rise the way it did in 1 year. And I thought it was. I always had to remember that this was a completely novel and terrifying experience to a lot of voters.
No, I think that's right. And the other problem is that inflation may go down, but the prices don't all come down.
Prices don't go down. That's right.
And so that for a lot of people, they were still going into the supermarket and seeing things much, much more expensive. And because of that, real wages went up more under Trump than under Biden because inflation was so low. My colleague Heather Long pointed that out in the Washington Post, and I think people experienced that. And I think something we're going to do a lot of studying on going forward is I still think there were hangovers from the pandemic, that there is still some chaos in people's lives, some memories of learning loss in the public schools, in all schools, but probably particularly in the public systems, which had less ease in dealing with it with much larger student bodies than, say, private schools did, and other dislocations in people's lives. And in an odd way, the pandemic helped Trump and hurt Biden. The pandemic helped Trump because people could say, oh, the economy was great except the pandemic, and that wasn't his fault. Inflation was actually also significantly caused by supply chain problems during the pandemic that resulted in the high inflation. But Biden got no grace for that fact. So it was an odd way in which the pandemic kind of helped Trump and hurt Biden.
At this moment, when a new administration is about to take office, I'm always reminded of a quotation I read attributed to Lyndon Johnson, who addressed the officials of his administration who lobbied the Congress, for all the different agencies. And he said that in however many years, 40 years in Washington in government as man and boy, he had never seen the Congress that didn't, in the end, take the measure of the man in the White House. That the Congress is here, it remains here, and it has a vested interest in its own authority. And we've been through a bit of this week in which the Republicans in the Senate chose a leader, and it wasn't the one whom Donald Trump preferred, I gather. It was John Thune. Is this Congress going to provide the cliche of the past year, a guardrail for presidential activities?
One could say that the most important thing about that vote is that it was conducted by secret ballot. And Trump himself did not endorse Rick Scott, who was clearly the preferred candidate of the Trump side, because he calculated that Scott was not popular in the Senate, which was proven out in the vote. And he decided he wasn't going to spend capital needlessly and offend whoever ended up winning. So I think all that is important. Having said that, it was, for somebody of my point of view, heartening that Republicans at least did not go along there and I wasn't surprised by Thune's victory. I would have been surprised if John Cornyn, his rival, had won. They were broadly the same kind of Republican, bred before the Trump era. And I think a lot of senators quietly said, we would prefer to have someone there who might occasionally protect us from Donald Trump. I think we're going to see a real test of whether there are any real guardrails because of the appointments that Donald Trump made yesterday. The appointment of Matt Gaetz as Attorney General was just shocking to many people in Washington. Most Republicans don't like or respect Matt Gaetz. Go back and look at some of the quotations from House Republicans about him, not simply because he was disruptive, obviously, of the House Republican majority in the last session, but also about him personally. And it's hard to think of someone who would have produced such a powerful negative reaction. And we're going to see if the Republican Senate goes along with that or not. There were at least some early indications that he might have some trouble. Similarly, Tulsi Gabbard, as Director of National Intelligence, the only thing as shocking as the Matt Gaetz announcement was Tulsi Gabbard, who seems to have had very close ties with Vladimir Putin, perhaps Mr. Assad in Syria. It's a really, it may have been an even more shocking appointment. And so I think, we will see. Now, Trump clearly knew that some of his appointees could run into some difficulty, which is why he has taken the unprecedented step of telling the Senate, I want to be able to make recess appointments, because he doesn't want his appointees subjected either to a vote in the Senate or to public hearings, where a lot of the issues that some of these appointees raised would come out. And I think what will be critical is if John Thune says, no, we are going to go regular order and we're going to have hearings and we're going to have a vote. And that's the first real test of whether there are guardrails remaining, even in an all-Republican Congress.
I mean, first, if Thune says, no recess appointment here, we will go through a nomination. And then second, what the outcome is in the vote on the case.
Correct, both. Pardon the noise outside here. I hope it's not penetrating too much.
No, we can't hear it.
Oh, good. No, that's exactly right. And you got to count to four. You need at least four if Bob Casey doesn't pull off a recount or something in Pennsylvania. He's the one Democrat who hasn't conceded yet, who lost, who is said to have lost anyway. It'll be 3 or 4 votes
Right.
that you need. And you can probably count up to 10 or 11 who might be in that category. 2 relatively easy ones, perhaps, in Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. But this is going to be a real test of what kind of guardrails we have, as you suggested.
Now, when you talked about what you didn't see in the election, what was right there to be seen, but you and many others missed, you mentioned entirely, I think, economic issues. And in addition, there's a whole list of cultural issues, and I don't know what we make of. I think immigration is every kind of issue. It's economic, it's political, it's social, whatever you want. How important was the Democratic position on immigration, if we can describe that, what the position was, or for that matter, things like the ability of trans girls to play on the girls' basketball team, an idea that was incessantly on television during the World Series and various NFL games.
So I would rate economics as first, without question. Immigration was clearly a central issue to Trump all the way through. And I think when Democrats look back, they'll probably tell themselves, it would have been better to deal with the crisis at the border, the sense of crisis at the border earlier in the administration. And that is clearly has been a central Trump issue since he came down that escalator. And then I do think the cultural issues mattered both directly and indirectly, although I'd give them third place behind the other 3. My hometown is a place called Fall River, Massachusetts. It's an old, mostly Catholic, once upon a time, very union working class town. Fall River voted for a Republican presidential candidate in this election, Donald Trump, for the first time in 100 years. The last time my hometown voted for a Republican, it was Calvin Coolidge. Al Smith converted them to Democrats. FDR kept them there. JFK kept them there. And as recently as sort of the Gore and Kerry and Obama elections, Fall River was voting 75%, 70 to 75% Democratic. Donald Trump narrowly carried Fall River. That was shocking. And I was driving through my hometown after the election, and I stopped by at an old diner called Al Mack's, been around since 1910, where I used to eat as a kid. And I asked a couple of local journalists to join me for breakfast, and I wanted to talk about why did my hometown flip. And they mentioned they focused very much on economic issues and some on immigration, but one of them raised the trans issue in an interesting way. It wasn't just that obviously there is discomfort, some discomfort and probably some bigotry about trans folks. And I think they're going to need a lot of protection in the next 4 years. And I hope Democrats don't back away from protecting people who are endangered. But it wasn't just the sports thing, which I think is an issue. My understanding about 6 months ago is that the Biden administration was going to take the position government shouldn't make that decision about sports, let private sports leagues do that. But the other part of it, according to one of these journalists, is when people saw that Trump ad, they heard the tagline that she cares about they, them, he cares about you. And for them, it was more Democrats are more engaged in these kinds of issues than in your economic problems. And I think that was an interesting way to think about it, because, without question, we've had a lot of social change in the country over the last 20 years, and that makes some people, particularly older people, uncomfortable. Some of the ways, I think that what's going to have to happen is Democrats are going to have to figure out how to stand up for the rights of beleaguered minorities always. I think they should never give up on that, but have to find ways of talking about it that are more inclusive, that make people more rather than less comfortable. I think gay marriage became popular because gay people came out, and so many Americans realized that one of their best friends, their cousin, their child in some cases, was gay. Right. There were fewer trans people. It's going to be more difficult for trans people, but I think there need to be ways to stand up for their rights, but talk about it in ways that make traditional people more comfortable. And as Governor Beshear of Kentucky, he vetoed a bunch of anti-trans legislation. And he said people accepted it because he did it from conscience. He actually talked about being a Christian and believing that everyone should be treated the same and treated fairly. Right. But he said the next day they knew I was going to be back talking about jobs and building roads and the like. And I think it was an interesting formulation that he has found, Governor Beshear has.
Well, let me pursue, though, the idea of the border, fixing the southern border and the immigration system. It's commonly said the immigration system is broken, that in fact we have whatever it is, 11, 12 million people. I don't know what the current most accurate estimate is of people who are living in the U.S. Without proper documentation. They either overstayed a visa or they snuck into the country. In either case, when they did it, they understood this isn't the way it's supposed to be done. This isn't the law in this country, but they did it just the same. Can you sympathize at all with people who say, look, they should have known. I mean, I'm sorry, but we have these laws, and Donald Trump is going to enforce the law. I can't imagine he's going to expel 10 million people from the United States.
Although that is his promise.
that is his promise. And Vance says that if a much smaller number are deported. Well, I have heard the actual Trump position on immigration described as being remarkably similar to what Obama was doing, which was deporting a great many people with criminal records,
right,
and protecting some people who've been here for a long time. In Obama's case, this whole class of the Dreamers was what was created. But can the Democratic Party remain a principled party that, as you say, protects minorities, but also says, we have a legal immigration system you're supposed to follow if you want to come into the country and you want to stay here. And if you didn't, our sympathy is limited.
No, I think that is a good question. I want to say a few things. The first thing I want to say is many of us, many people whose ancestors came here 100 years ago, say, or more, say, well, our people came in legally. And that always bothers me because most of our ancestors came here when there were almost no restrictions on immigration at all.
Yes, they were welcome.
Effectively had open borders and people poured into the country, including, we're grateful, I'm great, you and I are grateful, our ancestors. And so I always sort of get my back up when I hear that statement made. Secondly, there is something about the fact that our country allowed this to happen because the economy needed workers. And that the illegal immigration system became a fuel to our economy. And we were kind of two-faced about it as a country, which is we used all this labor as a country, and we allowed them to stay. And now all of a sudden we decide, no, well, this was a mistake. But we made it possible for them to come in and use their labor. But the third point that you make, I think, is important. I think there are two aspects to this. One is there is a sense, and I think Senator Chris Murphy may have been talking about this, there's a sense that people have that they don't really have much control over the decisions affecting their lives. And one thing they feel a sense of lack of control about is immigration, that they have certain views about the legality of immigration and the government can do nothing about this. And Trump's promise that I will do something about this is a way of saying we can control some of the forces around us, and I'm going to do it even if I have to do it forcefully. And yes, there is a sense that there's a reality that their entry, the entry of undocumented people, was in violation of the law. Now, it's one of the reasons why when you ask voters about immigration reform, which includes allowing people who have obeyed the law, stayed here legally, paid their taxes, that we can't really deport all these people. But in order for that to be acceptable to a majority, all the polling questions that find some majorities for that, and sometimes significant ones, say that they pay a fine or they make some restitution for being here illegally. And I think that's an important piece of finding any path to immigration reform. So, yeah, I get that sense that people have, and I particularly get that sense in communities where there have been high levels of recent immigration, where people feel somewhat displaced. Last point I want to make, Andy Kohut, the great pollster whom we lost some years ago, did a really wonderful study of which parts of the country, what kind of places are most anti-immigrant. And he found two kinds of places. The first is understandable, places that did not have a history of immigration and had a sudden influx of immigrants. And I think whatever, I'm broadly sympathetic to immigration, but I get why that it makes people feel displaced. But the other kinds of places that were very anti-immigrant were places with almost no immigrants at all. That's where the immigrant was a kind of alien and someone people didn't relate to. The places with the highest support of immigration are places that have always gotten a lot of immigrants, places like New York, places like Chicago or the Los Angeles. And I think that gives us something to think about and trying to move forward on immigration.
It is remarkable to me, though, that the employers of undocumented immigrants have been completely absent from the discussion of immigration this past year. I mean, at one time, there was a serious effort to try to get people to validate, to only employ people whose documents checked out, their Social Security cards were real. It appears to me, just listening to the discussion of immigration over the past year, that the people who have provided jobs to these people for the past several years are regarded as completely off the hook. And
in some of the immigration reform bills that failed, there were efforts to deal with that. And I suspect if we ever have immigration reform, and I don't see it coming very soon, unfortunately, because we do need to fix the system. I think that will be part of it. There was E-Verify system that was
E-Verify,
in place,
yes.
and so it has come up. But I agree with you that aspect of it it does not get the same attention as the immigrant, him or herself.
I'd like to hear what you make of a fact from at least from the exit polls, which is that the Democratic margin of the majority of Latino men who've been voting Democratic, that majority shrunk in this election from I think 12 or 13%, or excuse me, from over 20% to the low teens this year. And there are people who read all sorts of things into that decline of Latino support for the Democrats. Do you? Is it something that should prompt rethinking something on the Democratic Party side?
One of the things I think we forget is how well George W. Bush did with Latinos.
Mm-hmm.
And that in those years, so we're talking, say, the 2000s, and even before, a lot of people, I think Michael Barone, the political writer, was the first to use this metaphor. He said that Latinos could end up being more like Italian Americans
Yes,
over time.
yes,
And
I remember Linda Chavez citing that in an article.
yes, Linda Chavez
Republican
also
World.
used that, and
Yeah.
that and point one is Latinos are a lot of different kinds of people, and that they are people from Cuba and Venezuela and Colombia who have tended to be Republican, particularly Cuban Americans. They're from Puerto Rico and Mexico. They are from Central America and South America. So this is a very big and complicated group of people. Bush got 40 to 45% of the Latino vote in his two elections. Now, the difference is, of course, Bush was very sympathetic to immigrants. He gave some beautiful speeches about the role of immigrants in our society. And what's shocking to people is Trump can be so anti-immigrant and still get this share of the Latino vote. But I think that the Democratic surge among Latinos between the Bush years and now was the product of a particularly of the defeat of immigration bills and the language used by other Republicans over the years against immigration. I think Trump has won some of them back on the basis of some of the same reasons as before. First, evangelical Latinos are much more Republican than other Latinos. And for a while, evangelical Latinos shifted Democratic. They have shifted back to Republicans. The Tejanos, the people in South Texas, who are people whose ancestors were here before Texas was part of the United States, have had a distinct culture. They were key to this shift. Latino oil workers worried about what Democrats would do to the oil industry. There were a lot of reasons like that. And then there's talk, and here, before I would say anything, I'd like to see a lot more research. Did Latino men react to some of the sort of hyper male appeals that Trump and his campaign made? There's a lot of speculation about that. I haven't seen that yet in the data, but I'm sure there'll be talk about that. But I think what's important is that Latinos have been swinging around in the electorate more than we recognize over the last 20 years. And if Democrats took them for granted, they made a mistake. And that there's going to have to be, for the Democrats, there's going to have to be a lot more work among Latinos. It is, the gender gap among Latinos was very significant. Yeah. And I think we're going to look, there was a gender gap across the electorate. It seemed larger from what I looked at among Latinos. And I think that is going to be a matter of a lot of study because it raises a lot of issues.
I want to run past you the odd sequence of events this past week in which Donald Trump named his Secretary of State, and that that could have been out of the book about Lincoln's cabinet. I mean, he picks Marco Rubio, formerly his rival, his unsuccessful rival for the party's nomination, somebody whom he had mocked and.
Had mocked him.
Rubio had mocked him back, and there he is, a Secretary of State. People, you could think for a moment, it's going to be a more normal Republican administration with the usual kinds of people in senior cabinet posts. And then came Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, which felt the exact opposite of all of those reactions to the Rubio nomination. I just how what is the threat to our democracy, which is ostensibly our topic here, of a very highly partisan, rather undisciplined young man as Attorney General. I mean, as I say this, I'm thinking of the last time I remember hearing somebody say, the guy they're naming has barely practiced law, and he's too young to have this job. That was Robert Kennedy, who's uh, regarded as a sainted figure by many people today. What's riding on the Gates nomination right now? You said that there might be 11 Republican seats. Let's say there aren't. Let's say this one is really whipped, win one for Donald Trump.
No, I think you described the reaction to Gates perfectly. I think that is what makes people uneasy. I suppose the only other case, but he certainly was qualified, was John Mitchell, Nixon's attorney
Campaign
general,
manager, yeah.
who was his campaign manager. So that was clearly some politics there, and that didn't turn out so well in the end after Watergate. But I think that people were stunned by Gates because there was not even a patina that we're going to be serious about this job and we are not going to politicize the Justice Department, because it was just impossible to see how Gates would do anything but politicize the Justice Department. And I'm sure there's a lot of footage of his talking about Trump's enemies and the like that we're going to be seeing in the coming days. And it is very, very disconcerting. And you need an attorney general who will turn that down. I mean, when you think about Merrick Garland, he is probably going to come in for a lot of criticism for not moving earlier on Trump because of what happened to all these trials. But he was obviously making a decision that said, I don't want to politicize the Justice Department. I don't want to move too fast on this. I'm going to need a lot of evidence before I move. And that had the effects it had. But it showed someone who had in his head the fact that politicizing the Justice Department is dangerous. The irony is that Trump is using the fact that he got prosecuted as an excuse now to go after people, whether they did anything wrong or not. He's talked about Adam Schiff. He's talked about Nancy Pelosi. He's talked about, at some point or other, just about all his enemies that he wants legal action against. And it's the combination of who Matt Gates is and Trump's own statements that make one very, very troubled about this. And even if Gates is turned back, which is possible, it makes you nervous about what Trump's intentions are anyway. Because if he was willing to name someone like Gates, will the next one be somebody who's more obviously qualified but still have the same intentions? And we're going to have to ask that question if that comes about.
Foreign policy issues seldom determine the winner of a presidential election, but we do have two wars going on in the world that involve the United States in some way. The war in the Ukraine, where we've gone from a president deeply committed to the Ukrainian government, that is to say, Joe Biden, to a returning president who was he was impeached for his, I would say, cynical approach to arming Ukraine, and who's very proud of his close relationship with Vladimir Putin. And in the Middle East, we've gone from an administration that was trying to move the Israelis off their mark on negotiating and also on supplying food and medicine for Palestinians in Gaza, to a president-elect who's as close to Bibi Netanyahu as one could possibly imagine, and who actually shares the same problem of being prosecuted by his own government. Did either of those, or does either of those wars and the U.S. role in them do you think it figured much in the election? Did it change? Did it swing Michigan, for example, to be so supportive of Israel? And do you see changes coming in U.S. policy in those areas?
Let me take the Middle East first and Ukraine second, if I could, both on the political effect and the long term. I think the tragic irony for both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris is they may have ended up losing at both ends because of the position, both sides of the debate, because of the position they took on Gaza, which was way too supportive of Israel for many Arab American and Muslim American voters. Donald Trump carried Dearborn, Michigan, which is pretty shocking when you think about what Trump's position is and Dearborn's history of supporting the Democratic Party. And there, the mayor of Hamtramck, another place with a large Arab population, endorsed Trump. So they lost on that end. And then I think there's some evidence, and I want to look more at the results that there was a slight weakening of the Jewish vote for the Democrats because Kamala Harris kept saying, as Joe Biden did about even a little bit more strongly than Biden did about the need to protect Palestinians, her desire for peace. And so this position that the Biden administration took, which they would view as balanced, in the two key constituencies, both of them about 2/3 Democratic. It was a real wedge issue. It was a kind of double wedge issue for the Democratic Party. It really ended up hurting them. And I think the discussion after going forward on the Middle East and what role Gaza played in our election, I think is going to be very important. With Ukraine, it does not seem to have hurt Trump at all to essentially imply, I'm going to make peace with Putin quickly. And all of the affect is that it will require a lot of concessions from Ukraine. And I thought it was significant that he ruled out Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State. Mike Pompeo laid out a peace plan in Foreign Policy magazine, which did ask Ukraine to make some territorial concessions to Russia, but also assume that the rest of Ukraine would be protected by the West. And maybe that even is too much for Donald Trump. My hope on Ukraine is that there are still a lot of people in the Republican Party in Congress who have been supportive of Ukraine, who voted for Ukraine aid even after a lot of the party turned against it, that there will be at least some pressure on Trump from that direction. But it's troublesome. President Zelensky quickly moved to try to, he was praised Trump's great victory. He is hoping that maybe Trump's ties with Putin, whatever they are, might enable something to happen that wouldn't be a catastrophe for Ukraine.
Yeah.
On the Middle East, as we know, before the election, there was a report that Trump said to President Netanyahu, do what you need to do, Prime Minister Netanyahu, do what you need to do, and that was his position. Then there was another report saying that Trump wants a ceasefire and will push the Israelis in that direction. I don't know what Trump will do. But it's, I think the expectation is just as you described it, that he has been, except for a brief period when Netanyahu had the nerve to congratulate Joe Biden for winning the last election, has been very supportive of Netanyahu. And that's the expectation. But Trump is nothing if not unpredictable.
Well,
I'm curious how you see it, Robert, if I could ask.
I don't. I think that Trump is going to bring a real change of policy to Ukraine. I think that, as you say, the policy with regard to Israel was both sufficiently critical to lose them, as you say, to lose them the support of some Jews, not sufficiently critical to maintain the support of Muslims and Arabs. Excuse me. Um, the naming of Mike Huckabee as ambassador to Israel is being received in the far right circles of Israeli politics as a cue to go ahead and annex the West Bank,
Yeah.
which would
Yes.
which would create
Was-
in my person, some people would find that a great success. I think it would leave the Israelis in charge of a population of Palestinians who have no identity at all, and someday I suspect would say, "Well, just make us citizens of Israel." So I'm, it just I think it comes with the territory. Just worry about what's going on in Israel all the time.
No, and I think that the naming, obviously naming Huckabee is also let's be neutral about it. Fascinating,
Yeah.
because it also reflects this strong alliance of evangelical Christians, conservative evangelical Christians, with Israel. Now, the whole theory behind that is not very comforting to Israel, since the theology eventually sees the destruction of the state. But in the meantime, they have been, Benjamin Netanyahu has courted that support very
Yes.
actively.
And as have Israeli leaders for some time. When I first went there in the early, as I think when you were there, Menachem Begin was developing this relationship with American evangelicals.
Yeah, and no, that's true, and I think it's strengthened since since then. But Huckabee was certainly one of the surprises in a week of quite a few of them when he got named.
Yeah. So back to where we began. This was an election in which Republicans won lots. They won the White House. They won control of the Senate, it seems. And they held on to, it seems, control of the House. Not by a lot. In fact, none of those elections was achieved by a lot, as you say. This was not the equivalent of 1994 as a Republican win. It didn't come close to, I think, Obama's first election, the landslide Democratic victory. That result came unstuck and undone within 2 years in the case. How much are there things that you feel, changes that have been that have motivated voters in this past election that change that mark a change in the country, that reflect a change in the country that both parties had better get used to, because if only one does, it's going to keep on winning? Do we see a new view of America, something that not just a passing crisis of inflation, but something about how Americans see themselves that should guide politicians who are going to win elections in the coming cycles?
I think that we should first pay attention to the fact that we have now had 3 elections in a row in which the incumbent party lost power. Yeah. That from Obama to Trump, from Trump to Biden, from Biden back to Trump, which suggests the fact that there is no dominant party. There is a very skeptical electorate out there, that there are ties to party on the whole have paradoxically been strengthened and weakened at the same time. That we are more polarized than we were before. But as Alan Abramowitz, the political scientist, has been particularly forceful and effective in making this case, it's a negative partisanship, not a positive partisanship. If you ask people over time the view of their own party, it's about the same as it always was. If you ask people their view of the other party, it's far more negative than it was before. So that once upon a time, at least some significant percentage of us voted for our party because we like them. These days, we vote for a party because we really dislike the other party. And I think that helps explain a lot of things that are going on in our politics, particularly its bitterness. I think that if you look at it from the point of view of the left, I think the left's strongest argument is that since the rise of globalization and technological change, you've seen millions and millions of American workers displaced from what were well-paying union jobs, and that this has had uneven geographical effects. If you look at an electoral map, I show this map to my students. We got about 3,100 counties in the United States. In the 1996 election, Bill Clinton carried 1,500 counties, and you now helped a little bit by Ross Perot and a few of them, but basically, you know, a whole lot of counties in the middle of the country, some in the South voted Democratic. Joe Biden got elected with 2% more of the vote in 2020, carrying about 450 counties out of 3,100. Basically, the urban and metropolitan areas where most of the economic growth has happened. And so I think that there is some real economic discontent out there that has, you know, really became visible with Trump's first election, but had been floating around there, I think, since the 2000s. And I think that's a real problem. On the other side, we've also had an enormous amount of cultural change in the country. And I think there are Americans who are uneasy about that, whether it's the shifting demographics of the country, whether it's change in attitudes around sexuality. And that also creates some, you know, some of this chaos. So, you know, now the only comfort to us, we like to think of ourselves as exceptional, we Americans. This is a lot of what is happening in Western Europe as well. And you're seeing the rise of parties and movements that don't have quite the power of the Trumpist movement because we have a two-party system. And in those systems, they're multi-party systems. So there is still a traditional conservative movement separate from the far right. Nonetheless, you are seeing this happen in Europe along some of the same lines, including metropolitan versus countryside and small town. So we're going through a very chaotic time in the West, and that is, to go to our theme, a real challenge to democracy itself.
Well, EJ, I want to thank you, and I want to bring back Suzanne, who's been gathering questions from the audience, and should have some for you.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting and important conversation. What might happen with the Democratic Party with such a split in the party between the far left progressives and the more moderate centrists? Is there a chance that a formidable third party might emerge?
You know, I've had conversations about this with people over the last week, and when people use a term like far left, I always say how you view the center depends on which direction you look at it from. And I don't know whether I could see why some people may call the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wing far left. I think it's simply, I see the party largely divided between left and center left. You know, that the moderate wing is sort of broadly speaking more progressive, I think, than what the moderate wing might have been 30 years ago. I have argued now for a long time that the alternative to a Trumpist coalition, or for that matter, a conservative coalition, is an alliance of the center and left. There is no escaping for people who are either moderate or progressive that these wings are going to have to come together. And I think there are the economic argument is going to be about how forcefully should Democrats go after big corporations? How populist should they be? And there are people who are fairly moderate who say that Democrats need to be more populist if they're going to win back the working class votes they have lost over time, that working class voters do not identify with the Democrats anymore as standing against whom they might see as the enemy. There are obviously other economically moderate Democrats who say this rhetoric won't help them. But I wonder if we've seen the limits in this election of how big a coalition you can build with suburban, middle-class, relatively well-off voters. So I think there's going to be a debate about which voters do you need to go after and what kind of economics do those voters want, and obviously substantive debates about what's the right economic approach. On culture, it's fascinating because you see some people on the left. Bernie Sanders said something like this: we got to stop talking about identity politics and start talking about class. And so I think in the debates about how Democrats should approach cultural issues, you're going to see some odd coalitions in the party between some people on the left who really want a more class-oriented approach, who might agree with more moderate people in the party who want moderation, more moderation on cultural issues. I think the last thing is, I think there are a lot of the ideological arguments of this sort, which will definitely happen. The questioner's absolutely right about that. Will partly be solved by the nature of the new leaders who come along. Because I think that successful coalition builders, successful leaders, figure out how to talk about certain issues that were difficult in ways that can pull a coalition together. And sometimes issues disappear. And if I can be allowed, one of my favorite stories of American politics, the Democratic Party was utterly riven by prohibition in the 1920s. Their urban, mostly Catholic and Jewish supporters were very anti-prohibition. Their Southern Baptist and other supporters were dries. They were against prohibition. In 1932, a Democrat—
for prohibition.
I'm sorry?
They were
in favor of prohibition. The wets and the dries. And in 1932, in the middle of the Great Depression, a Democrat from Missouri wrote Jim Farley, FDR's political aide, and said, I don't understand it. Why are wets and dries arguing with each other when nobody can afford the price of a drink? And the prohibition issue was kind of pushed aside by the Great Depression. Now, I'm hoping there's not a Great Depression in our country, but I think some of these splits can go away. And prohibition is one issue that divided the country for 50 years and then effectively disappeared, except in local referenda about whether your town should be wet or dry. And I think some of these issues might get transcended. I think gay marriage is a good example of an issue nobody argues about anymore because it's become so popular.
Thank you. What do you see might be the impact of this election on the Jewish community, particularly when it comes to anti-Semitism? And could some of the violent Jew hunting that we are seeing in Amsterdam and Berlin and other places in Europe happen here?
I guess I am always, the famous book that came to the opposite conclusion of its title, It Can't Happen Here. I am always reluctant to say that none of these things can happen in the United States. Philip Roth's novel about what an alternative view of the 1940s. So I like to think we Americans have been sort of special on issues of religious tolerance. And I do think we have the First Amendment and our history of pluralism gives us some advantages on the issue of religious openness and at least toleration. But I worry about this. I mean, we had the Tree of Life synagogue event. We have seen the appearance of anti-Semitism. I don't know if this election has an effect on that one way or the other. I just pray that it doesn't happen. I think that splits over what's happening in Israel will continue. I do notice that the campuses have been, on the whole, somewhat more peaceful since students came back in September. But I guess I am not Jewish, but I'm one of those people who always worries about the rise of anti-Semitism, as the questioner probably does too. So my hope is we still have some antibodies here that will contain anti-Semitism, but it is always a potential threat.
And somebody else wanted, what about the health and safety of other minority groups in the country?
Well, I am very worried about what kind of immigration roundup Trump has in mind. And I think it's going to be very important for people of a progressive bent, people opposed to prejudice of all kinds, to rally to the support of people being deported. Because one of the great worries here is beyond, if, on the one hand, as Robert pointed out earlier, there have been over the years a lot of deportations of people who broke the law, and this happened under President Obama. But a deportation that is as massive as the one Trump is talking about, is going to pick up a lot more people. It's going to potentially pick up people who are here legally. It's going to split up families who have mixed immigration status, whether a husband and a wife or the parents and the children. And I very much worry about that. And I hope a lot of decent people, including some people who may have voted for Trump, will say we can't have this. And I think it could be, again, if it's carried out on the scale he's talking about, and the gentleman he named to carry this out has talked in the most expansive way possible. This is going to tear some of our communities apart. And I just hope that we stand up for people who are being herded out of our country in a utterly inhumane, what sounds like an inhumane way, creating detention camps and the like. I think is very disconcerting, and that's a mild word.
Yeah.
And as we wrap up, we have to wrap this up. So with the lack of civil discourse and the lack of compromise, not just in Congress, what do you suggest to people? I mean, what might be the impact on our democracy going forward if people don't learn how to talk to one another in person, on social media, wherever they are?
I've always had this dream that I wanted religious congregations that were progressive on the one side and conservative on the other. I'm not talking about, conservative Reform Orthodox. I'm talking about larger politics here. Sort of made a point of getting together and trying to begin dialogues that, in principle, religious people who think about, things like the Golden Rule, which I think crosses our denominations and our different traditions within them, might begin an effort at dialogue. But I am very worried about the media that people consume now, because I think this election will send a lot of people thinking about how mainstream media probably had less influence on this election than any other election in our history. And that many more people got their news, such as it was, either from partisan media or from TikTok or from Facebook. And some of that stuff they read is from traditional media.
Mm-hmm.
But when you think of all of us way back in the day, watching the same evening news every night, it wasn't perfect. It didn't have everything in it. But there was at least some common ground of information, and then we argued about it. And I worry that we're in an environment, and I'm not saying anyone on this call doesn't know. I think we're not arguing from the same ground anymore, the same ground of fact. And that's been true for a while, but I think this election, I dare not call it a crisis point, because everybody uses the word crisis that way. Somebody said there should be a book called The Crisis Crisis. But I think it's a real turning point, this election. And that really troubles me, because at least when you share facts, you can have a civilized argument. And I think right now, so much argument is who can say it louder, not entering imaginatively into the ideas of your opponent, as Christopher Lasch, the great historian, once put it, if only to try to persuade them, but in the process, put your own ideas at risk. And we're not putting our own ideas at risk very much now. And I think that's a real loss to us.
Anything positive to say about the state of our democracy before we leave?
I am struck that there was a relative clarity of response to the appointments of Gates and Tulsi Gabbard. So in the short, immediate term, I think that there are still maybe lines that can't be crossed, and we'll see what happens there. And I think that as long as we have freedom, there's real opportunity to organize. And I have sensed that there are a lot of people whose response to this election on the Democratic side was to kind of turn off the politics and watch the NBA, which I confess I have done some of as an ardent Boston Celtics fan. But I think people are talking about what we need to do. How can we organize? How can we actively promote things we care about, protect people who need protection? And I don't think we've lost that because of this election. And I think that after people get over get over this particular election, in the case of people who voted for Harris, their disappointment, in some cases shock, I think we are Americans. We do end up organizing in the end. And as long as we maintain our democracy, we'll have the right to win again. My favorite book title I'll close with about politics. Larry O'Brien, former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, his memoir was called No Final Victories. And no final victories means no final defeats. And as long as we have a democracy, there are no final defeats.
And he was also commissioner of the NBA.
He was. We brought it all together. Thank you.
Well, EJ and Robert, thank you so much for this really important, informative conversation. I want to thank our audience for joining us. I want to remind everybody to go to momentmag.com to sign up for our program for next week about Muslim-Jewish relations, talk about starting that dialogue. And we will be sending this recording out to everybody as well. It'll be on our website tomorrow. So again, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, EJ.
Bye-bye.